This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Getting today's show started is K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien with this week's grain market update. He talks about the current market as well as price outlook probabilities. K-State farming systems specialist Ignacio Ciampitti keeps the show rolling as he explains how saturated soil and standing water in corn and soybean fields can affect the crop. Chip Redmond, K-State meteorologist, ends today's show by saying how more of Kansas has received rain for this week's weather update. He also discusses what weather is expected for the coming week. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update. And as always, we're joined by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, what are we seeing for futures for the grain market?
Well, we're in a time of, I wouldn't say we're languishing, but we are trying to figure out the direction of the markets. It does seem that when you look at futures closes yesterday here at 448 and 3/4 for July, corn, Dees 471, soybeans 1209 and 3/4, November, the harvest contract 1190, and wheat 709, the July contract for hard red winter 709 and a half, and then first post harvest contract 723 and a half. Also, really, you don't see movement that indicates a lot of worry in the futures market. In fact, what you do see would be a move in corn, for instance, to where we had been down as low as about 435, had jumped up to about 475. Now we're back to 448. So basically, we're in the middle of that range. That'd be for the July contract. I think this brings elements of seasonality in. I think we may have intended to talk about that later, but it's really at play here right now in the futures. And that here we've gotten through planting season in the U.S. There aren't really major concerns showing up that people are giving much attention to. Still time value, you might say, in the markets of all of June, all of July, and August, September to get through. But yet the latest set of USDA numbers for corn, again, optimistic for yields. They're assuming normal conditions all the way through, really indicating no major shortfall in the grain markets yet. And I would say a shortfall would be something below 2 billion bushels ending carry out. I think their latest set of numbers were about 2.1 billion. So nothing major there yet. And for soybeans, pretty similar situation, not really any major worries at this point domestically. Again, planting time windows for soybeans are still mainly out in front of us, although when you look at some of the most recent USDA numbers for planting progress, it does show that we're 68% planted, 63% being the last 5-year average. So in isolated pockets, we've had too much moisture or whatever, but overall, the market looks at planting progress for corn and soybeans and says, well, nothing there to worry about yet. And because of that, we have kind of what I'd call this moderation of prices. Did want to get back to, I'd mentioned soybeans here. We traded up as high in the last couple of weeks of about 1255 or so for the July contract. Closed yesterday at 1209 and 3/4. So had been as low earlier on as like 1140 thereabouts. So again, both corn and soybeans not really expressing any major weather production worries yet. We still have questions that continue in terms of South America. You've got a report that came out for soybeans yesterday that the flooding in the Rio Grande del Sul area probably will result in about 5 million metric tons less soybeans. So that's enough to have some impact on the availability of soybeans for export and world ending stocks. Yet that's more of a probably more of a backloaded issue on the markets than a front-loaded one, in that still we'll have a glutted harvest coming out of there. And frankly, you see some of that change now in that anticipation of availability in the weekly exports now for soybeans that the U.S. is sending out. Where for the week ending May the 16th, they have a preliminary estimate. This would have been the USDA AMS Ag Marketing Service grains inspected for export figure, not the final Foreign Ag Service number, but the preliminary number, just under 8 million bushels exported. Need about 18 to meet the USDA's projection for this marketing year, and we had similar low numbers a week ago. So worries in the soybean market that what had been fairly brisk exports are now probably, they may be slowing down in anticipation of what's coming out of South America. So you've got that going on. And again, on the subject of seasonality for soybeans, whereas we're concerned about reproductive issues and really heat stress hitting corn in July during tasseling, for soybeans, we look at flowering, etc., typically more so during August for the bulk of U.S. soybeans. And all of that risk, if there is any, is still out in front of us. And still hold in the back of my mind anyway, projections of weather issues to transition from El Nino to La Nina projected to hit right during that same time frame. But the markets, obviously, when you look at futures upfront markets for corn and soybeans, and also for corn and soybeans, they're not expressing any of that worry yet. So until it comes, we're going to assume normality and keep going. And that's frankly what the USDA numbers are. But I do need to mention on wheat, we have wheat futures had closed for the weakness that we've kind of seen in other crops over the last week or so. When you saw wheat, at least in my thinking, not quite as weak as as the other commodities. And let's see if that holds up to scrutiny. So you had July close yesterday at 709.5, down about 10.25 cents. And again, at 7, sure, it's up markedly from where it had been. Again, we had seen wheat at its lowest at about 550. That was back on March 1st. Had jumped up to about 625. Had trended as high as about 740, and now down to about 709. So you've got the short run point of reference is about the 740 number, and then you can be disappointed that if you're a seller, that wheat's down to about 709, but yet we're way higher than the 625 that we had seen before. I would like to add in, I read an interesting commentary, and it really came more out of Europe than in the U.S., where speaking about how at least from one analyst's perspective, that the wheat market had been planning on large supplies, hadn't really bought a lot ahead, and that the recent run-up in prices was kind of a surprise to the market. And of course, you and I have been talking about for a while how the USDA numbers, as they come out month after month after month, keep tightening up the projections for world's ending stocks of wheat, for world minus China ending stocks of wheat, again down to 18.6% on that May 10th WASDE report, and that's down from 19.4 last year, from 20.4 the year before, 21-22, 21%, 23, and you're marking your 21-22, and you just keep going back until all the way back to the recent high of 2015-16, 25.4. So we're on this trend where we're tightening up world supplies, but yet, as long as Russia and Ukraine, frankly, but mainly Russia now, had adequate supplies, had no problems in the wheat market, at least in terms of international millers, but got to this point, and that really hasn't, I guess I should say, it's not that it hasn't mattered so far till we get to this point, and now you start to see, well, gosh, prices have ran up. Have we been caught short? You could see this coming. It's kind of like the slow temperature increase on something that's boiling until there it is suddenly. Well, it's boiling enough that now we have wheat futures with $7 instead of $5.50, and we'll see where it goes from there.
And Dan, on this past Wednesday, you did a webinar called Winning the Game, where you looked at the possibility of price outlooks.
Here on Wednesday of this week, we looked at just quickly outlook for corn, for soybeans, and for wheat. And basically, in so many words, for the coming market in Europe, in my own thinking, is about a 40% chance that the USDA's projection is right, with this current set of numbers at at about 14.6 billion bushels production, ending stocks at 2.1 billion bushels, and probably about a 60% chance that we have something less than their record high production through whatever set of maladies we have to deal with yet. Something closer to about 14.5 billion bushels ending stocks, about 1.8 billion bushels of that, and prices instead of the USDA's projection of 440, something closer to about 550. So that's a pretty dramatic, radical opinion. But yet, even with decent weather so far, to say, gosh, we're going to have that high a yield in the U.S. as of yet. And we also looked at soybeans. The USDA's projection hinged on another record high yield, 52 bushels per acre, and the assumption we'll have normal production all the way through. I plugged in 50, which is kind of an average of the last several years, and just 2 bushels per acre on the acres that we have changed the ending stocks figure by about 150 million bushels, and the price projection from about USDA's projection 1120 up to about 1280, 1290. So again, that's also quite a different situation. Again, the idea being that there's probably about a 40% chance that the USDA is right, and 50-60% that, hey, we still have a good yield, but not as high as that. And then for wheat, finished up on that, and the USDA has projected $6 per bushel for their crops, 766 million bushels carry out, 40% stocks to use, and you have either marginally lower yields or higher exports because of these problems in the Black Sea region, both combining to give us a season average price that's above $7. And if short yields and international crop problems come, then you're above 8. So we were accused on that of being bullish. I don't know how in this market you can be bullish, but we're trying to be objective and weigh the risks of what's out there for the markets. And at least in my thinking, we're right in the window now. We'll be in June, July, August, when the truth will, I guess it's truth-telling time to see what actually happens in the field in the U.S. and where these markets go.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about standing water in saturated soils in crop fields. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. Ignacio, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for your time.
Ignacio, first wanting to talk about corn and how saturated soils can impact this crop.
I mean, that's a good question. And of course, we need to clarify that depends where we are located across the state, because we have many people already got planted. So if you look at different situations, I mean, we still are getting rains in many parts of the state. So depending on the conditions, if you are in a soil that is very fully drained spots, those are the situations that we might be more concerned. Most of the large impacts is when the plants are very small, when you are thinking about very young plants, when the roots are basically small, and then most of the times is when the soil is getting saturated, what happens is it tends to stop the activity of the root growth. We have issues basically of that plant to expand leaves, and also mainly basically produce, and work on the photosynthesis of fixing carbon and growing, if you want to say in a simple way, mainly because that lack of oxygen, and in many situations with those rains, we have basically low temperatures. So, and you will see indication of these problems because that corn is going to look with some yellow leaves. I mean, it's going to look stunted. If these things happen only just for a very short time, those plants can recover. And the question that we get all the time is, what is the tolerance level? And we say that they can tolerate for a few days. In many situations, I mean, it could survive, for like 2 to 4 days, depending on the conditions. The issue or the main factor is when the growing point is submerged. In that case, the growing point is submerged, then it's more critical. And we know that any situations is more than 2 days, that oxygen is depleted, and then the plant is starting basically failing. And then we start seeing those very young plants kind of slowly dying. I mean, if the conditions of saturation, they last for many, many more days. As I mentioned before, if you think about the timing, until V6 is the moment that 6 leaves, when plants are taller and the growing point is about the surface, less problems. all the time, okay? We already seen that many situations this big problem early season, and usually, yes, it can reduce yields, but again, it needs to be a very extreme event, and then the yield reduction might depend based on the impact. If we have a long-lasting saturation problem, that is basically, we might start seeing yield reduction, mainly because we are losing plants, and that is one of the big factors.
Ignacio, what concerns come with these plants having water on them for too long?
The main concern is this situation that the plants are basically not having enough oxygen, and then start creating some damage. And we know that basically the cloudy weather might limit the impact. In many situations, we see some impact, for example, of other complications. Not only just the problem of water standing on the fields, we also are seeing interaction with other factors. We see potential problems with diseases because flooding can increase the incidence of any moisture disease like a crazy top downy mildew. And those environment conditions like saturation for 48 hours, basically, they really promote infestation. And then this is when we start seeing these kind of problems of, eventually you will be reflecting these issues when you will see later in the season when tassels and ears, they can be disorganized in a very small mass of leaves. And this is what we call the crazy top cone. You will see situations that it happens late in the season, and many situations, it really comes from the problem that the plants were under saturation problems. Other concerns, we are losing nitrogen. We know that when you have saturated soils, we're losing fertilizer by leaching because plants, that nitrogen is not getting to the roots. It's leaving the profile, the soil, and the nitrification too. So that nitrogen is leaving the field. And those are issues because if farmers are considering the optimal end rate, they need to take this into account. If they apply all the nitrogen early season, they need to really consider basically how they are applying nitrogen late season because they might see some deficiencies too. And then there are some other factors, just briefly to name a few, problems of green snap because we might have issues of standability on those plants. We also have seen issues, for example, of the effect of cold weather connected to flooding on the crown. And when the crown is affected closer to the roots, it's an issue because most of this area is becoming more leaky. And then the main factor that it happens is that those plants will basically have various problems, later on in the season for standability, And those are things that you will see that, again, plants are failing. We tend to see kind of a poor growth in extreme environmental situations when you have this phenomenon lasting for many, many days. We tend to see that we are even losing some plants. The best advice, in many situations for corn is like, if you have this environment, look at the field, look at the low areas, because those are the areas of the field that water might be standing for longer, and check specifically to see if you can find these scenarios of yellow symptoms or problems on the plants or plants that are stunted or lack of growth. And you can just take a look to digs on roots and see if there is an effect on roots too.
And Ignacio, do we see some of these similar problems when it comes to soybeans?
Yes, and then when we look at soybeans, it's quite similar. And we know that in many situations, similarly, if the plants were only submerged less than 48 hours, there is a very good chance that those plants are going to survive. The issue in many situations is when they are submerged up to 7 days. And when we are talking about more than 7 days, the temperature is a factor, as we mentioned before. Sometimes, cooler temperatures help. If you have warmer temperatures, like warmer than 80 degrees as an average for the days, those tend to exacerbate the effect. In soybeans, in many situations, as I mentioned, in many conditions, the injury or the time that is affecting the, saturated soils, to these plants is also connected to the lack of oxygen to the roots. That's the main issue. But depends on the growth stage, as we mentioned to corn, depends on the duration of the effect and the stress, and depends on many other factors. So scouting is big factor to make sure that we ask farmers to get out, look at the lowest spots in the field, and trying to assess basically what are the main situations or problems. We know that, to give examples, we know that basically if we are looking at, germination, early season, waterlogging seed problems or water standing on the fields. I mean, we know that can reduce germination. We have seen problems on germination in some extreme situations that they are reducing that germination by up to 40%. That is one of the problems. If you are late during the season, so if you are around, I would say probably 2 to 4 trifoliates, I mean, that basically short water saturating, soils, they will potentially cause some yield reduction, but needs to be at least for more than 2 to 3 days. If it's very short, which is what we are experiencing in some areas at this moment, that usually they don't last too long, it's very unlikely that we're going to see yield reductions, okay? But most of that yield reductions, they usually are going to come when the plants are early in the season. So the plants start moving into flowering to reproductive stages. Waterlogging and the effects of waterlogging is very minimum. And many times if we see impact, it's going to be more yield reductions when we are getting into the early vegetative stages.
Ignacio, how could someone check their soybean crop to see if it was really impacted?
I would say the main factor and the same, recommendation is for corn is you need to get out. You need to look at other potential factors because we talk about disease. For soybeans, it's exactly the same. We talk about soil because if you are in a sandy soil that drain quickly, you have more options, so you have less problems. If you are in clay soils, that the drainage is slow, so we know that we're going to see more problems and potential injury on this. And this depends also on the areas of the field. If you are in the upper part of the field versus being in a lower section of the field, and then the combination of, mentioned before, the compendium of different diseases, early season diseases like Pythium, Phytophthora, Rhizoctonia. Most of these diseases, for soybeans, they're going to play a key role too. And if they're, around, they're going to basically produce a larger impact in the fields. Farmers need to get out. They need to look at those areas of the field that they are problematic, and they need to basically make an assessment if there is a problem of number of plants. So if they are losing stands, many times could be very visible because you walk through the field, you will see reduction in the number of plants, and also pay attention to the size of the plants. Pay attention if there are any difference in growth, okay? And those are the key factors that when you are scouting, scouting early season is going to be helpful to make sure that this is one of the, I would say warning signs, before we can start, forecasting yields.
Ignacio, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about standing water and saturated soils in our crops.
Thank you so much for your time.
That was K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, I will link to recent Agronomy e-update articles in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, what weather did we see this past week?
What weather haven't we seen this week? It's been a very dynamic week. We've had multiple rounds of severe weather. We've had some areas of localized flooding. We've had some beautiful weather as well, with sunny skies, cool overnight lows, and actually below average temperatures. So a little bit of everything. Saturday was a big highlight for severe weather. Thankfully, it didn't come to fruition as bad as it could have, with the worst severe weather conditions kind of remaining to our south and to Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas. But we still saw some wind damage as well as some hail that was mostly isolated. The most widespread we saw was in the Kansas City and then across portions of north central Kansas. We did have a couple of small tornadoes along the Oklahoma border, but they were not impactful. So a dynamic week, but really most of that to say we had some precipitation in places that needed it, that haven't seen a whole lot over the last 2 weeks, and that goes to say, especially for folks in portions of the western Kansas, we see multiple rounds of thunderstorms now form off east of the mountains in Colorado and moved eastward into western Kansas. And that brought some good moisture just in the last 2 to 3 days. We saw totals up over 2 inches of rain in some areas. So especially the event that we had over the last 2 days hit an area that hadn't seen a lot of rain. That stretched from kind of Lakin to eastward into the La Crosse area and even Great Bend area. So needed rainfall and a dynamic weather pattern.
With a lot of people in Kansas receiving precipitation, did we see positive changes in the drought monitor?
Yeah, so a lot of our rainfall that we saw over the weekend was focused in the east, where we already have had basically a complete erase of any drought conditions. This recent rainfall fell after the drought monitor cutoff. That is Tuesday morning. So we just saw subtle, small changes where we did see some expansion in D3 extreme drought in those areas that ironically got precipitation in the last 2 days. And then we did see some decreases just in central Kansas, some small areas of decrease. So overall, not a huge change in the drought monitor. But as you go forward into the next week with these several more opportunities of precipitation across the state, the hope is that we will make some good ground and some improvements in the drought monitor.
And is that precipitation we're seeing, hopefully moving forward, really going to be widespread or more of a hit and miss?
Yeah, we're in that time of year where it's all convective precipitation, so very, very focused in one area and heavy, and we can see big changes over very small distances. So no real widespread. The hope is that after 4 or 5 days of isolated precipitation in areas that are more focused, that we can start to average that out across a larger area. Most people should see rain over the next 7 days, but how much is really going to decide if you end up underneath one of these heavier rain showers.
What temperatures can people be expecting moving forward?
Yeah, so we're going to keep the precipitation chances around nearly daily for the next 7 days. But overall, our temperatures are going to start to slowly increase. We were expecting by this time last week, we were expecting us to be in a warming trend as you go into this coming weekend into early June. That kind of got pushed back a little bit. We still have high pressure building off to our west. That's going to be a concern for heat increases as we get later into June. It's been kind of pushed off, but it's still likely going to happen. And so temperatures are slowly warming. We're not going to be at the slightly below average like we've been the last few days. And that's going to bring some additional stressors with it. We've had a lot of moisture, especially in western Kansas, and I start to get concerned about if temperatures do start increasing like we expect over the next 7 days with the recent moisture. That's going to increase cattle stress, especially if cattle are not acclimated to the warmer, humid conditions. So something just to keep an eye out, and folks need to be paying attention to that 7-day forecast so they can be proactive and minimize any potential impact of loss.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.